This is my friend Rachel, who I have worked with, once so far, hopefully in the future as well, and wanted to have a conversation about her work, some of the things that she's exploring in her work that I feel really resonates with some of the themes that I've been exploring. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about how I met Rachel, and then we'll kind of get into the kind of work that she does. I can't remember who told me about it, or where I read it. Maybe I was in a coffee shop or something, and there was something about 3 artists were going to hide kind of pieces of art around Belfast, and then you would go and try and find these things. And a friend of ours, Micah, was involved in that, and maybe that was how I'd heard of it. So I remember going down into Belfast and kind of taking part, starting to walk around, and that's where I connected with you. That's where I first met you, and where I first encountered these little ceramic bowls. Would you call it ceramic bowl?
Yeah, pots probably.
Pots,
yes.
That were hidden. How many did you?
In Belfast, it was 100.
100.
Yeah.
So 100 of these were hidden around Belfast. Oh, with a few of these slightly bigger black bowl.
Yeah, black porcelain. Yeah.
Yes. So I, when I encountered it, I was like, very struck, very taken by this style, which I guess is inspired by that Japanese, is it Kintsugi?
Yeah, Kintsugi.
Kintsugi, which is, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Kintsugi is an ancient Japanese technique of mending broken pots with gold, and then as a result the pot becomes more beautiful and more precious. But it's become very mainstream, like it's popping up everywhere. I think even it was in a recent Beyonce video. Wagamama have used it. And it's good that it's become so well known, because it makes my pots quite instantly relatable. When you say it's Kintsugi, a lot of people have some sort of knowledge of Kintsugi. But I think what I love about Kintsugi the most is that it bears witness to the wound. It bears witness to the story. And so the wound doesn't disappear. The gold highlights it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So traditionally, am I right that it would be a pot would break, and this was a traditional way of repairing a pot, but not trying to hide the cracks, but almost show them or even exacerbate them in some way?
To show the beauty in the cracks. And it was an ancient Japanese technique used mostly in the Japanese tea ceremonies. So when a tea bowl broke, they would painstakingly pick up these shards and glue it back together with, it's really a gold resin. And then that pot would be continually used in the ceremony, but it was more precious in the ceremony.
Yes.
And these flaws, these cracks, were the beauty of it.
So what I liked about your piece in particular, which is slightly different as well, is that this isn't something that was kind of whole and then broken and then repaired. These were made with this wound. And when I first saw it, in fact, you might have seen just last week I did a talk, and in a talk I was talking about something we did in Icon, which was this image. Oh, you commented on this.
I love that. Yeah,
the sweater that unraveled and new people were knitting something. And sometimes an image catches me, and an image just says in more than words can say, something captures something. And when I saw this, I was like, this felt like a beautiful metaphor for the subjectivity, the idea that I've explored in my work in various places and in psychoanalysis, that there is a primordial wound. We're all wounded. It's not something contingent that happens to some people. There's different wounds that happen to us, but all of us have a type of trauma and a type of wound that we can never cover over. We try to cover over, but in some ways the challenge of life is to face that. So I saw this and I was like, oh, this feels like such a beautiful artistic reflection of something that I try to articulate. And then actually I found out that you actually knew my work. What was your connection to me?
I think I followed you on Instagram for a while, probably early Icon
right
stuff.
back.
Yeah. And then I knew the connection through Michael Purnell, who's an artist I've worked with on this project. So
because you're originally from Northern Ireland, you should say that. You live in
I grew up in County Tyrone, but I live in Macclesfield, which is South Manchester.
So whenever I encountered Rachel and I was like, oh, you actually know this work, so that makes it a lot easier as well, because sometimes if I'm trying to explain what I'm doing, it can be quite a lot. So Rachel came to my Spark retreat and ran a series of workshops. So maybe that's a good place to start. Tell us a little bit about, because you've done these workshops and these conversations around the world, inspired by people actually making their own pots. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. As you've said, it was a public art exhibition where I placed these little pots along the streets of Stoke and Manchester and Belfast, and then I would ask people to, if they wanted to, they could upload a comment on the website of where they found the pot and how the pot resonated with them. And I think what's quite overwhelming about this project is people are so willing to speak about their wounds. And then when I met you and you had asked me to run a workshop at Spark, it was great because I had never really considered it being a workshop. I always just saw it as a public art exhibition or an exhibition within a gallery context. So it was a really great opportunity for me to think, okay, how could I make this into an immersive, kind of contemplative, reflective workshop? And Spark gave me that chance, and I was really pleased with how it landed in Spark, and people were really receptive to it, and the stories I got back were incredible as always. And since Spark, I've been invited into many venues, so from conservative evangelical churches right into community groups, charities. I've worked with groups of refugees, and then just a couple of weeks ago I was invited into a corporate space in a quite well-known company, into their leadership team. And that was probably the one I was most nervous about, because it was a completely new context for me, and especially as an artist, to be invited into a space like that. But they were incredibly receptive again, and I think what I'm reminded about, whether I'm working with a group of refugees or I'm working with a CEO of a successful company, the stories are as deep and the wounds are as heartbreaking. And in that particular one, in the corporate setting, part of the workshop, I get people to write down their own scars, and they place them in a little box. And I don't do anything with those. It's just that idea of releasing it. And it always takes me about a day to read them. So the next day I open up the box and I take out the stories. And this one person in this corporate space just wrote on the card, "I feel so lost, full stop." And it just never ceases to amaze me, no matter what position you could be holding in this world, or whatever your background is, we all carry a wound of some sort.
Yeah,
we all have a scar to bear. Bear.
There's I'm reminded of someone who I've taken increasing interest in recently. I've always found her interesting, but she's also a very difficult author in many ways, Simone Weil. And she's difficult because she wrote sporadically and kind of in like journals and diary entries, but incredibly brilliantly. And she would write, not systematically, but she would say these very pregnantly powerful things. And when you read Weil, she has this sense of universal suffering. And when we hear of suffering and we think of suffering, we obviously think of particular things that have happened to us, even if it's a small thing like damaging your thumb, to a big thing like losing someone you love. But Simone Weil is saying something deeper than that. She's acknowledging that we all have different levels of suffering, and we can protect ourselves to greater or lesser extents. But there's something about being a creature of desire, which means a creature of lack, a creature who longs. There's something about longing that we all have that's part of our subjectivity, and longing is connected to suffering, because longing is absence and loss. And in some early psychoanalysis, you have the idea, which is still, I think, there's really interesting insights into it, but that the first loss is from the mother. That symbiotic relationship, that we're so close, and most of our, to be honest, probably most of our problems come from the way that we separate. Was it too soon? Was it too late? Was it harsh? Was it not? Like there's all this stuff that happens around exclusion and becoming a subject that's very, very painful. And so for Vey, you get this sense in which we're all, that's kind of the scar, that's the foundational ontological scar that we all carry. And we all have different identities and sexualities and come from different places and different languages. But there's something of this lack, this wound that is where we meet. And you were saying before we even started recording, you mentioned there, but that from the corporate world to working with refugees, you see that there is this sense of suffering that is part of the human experience.
Yeah, just that universal state that we're all wounded in one way or the other. And it's interesting what you said about the cushioning, how we can protect ourselves almost from feeling that, and however we do that, whatever way we decide to protect ourselves from that. And I think actually as an artist, I feel that almost we steer people into the pain. It's part of the role is to give language for something that is maybe unspeakable. And when words fail, that's often when art takes over.
Yes.
So that physical object can say the very thing that is in you, and sometimes that helps steer you into that place that maybe you have been protecting yourself, or
that's the part of it. Like in psychoanalysis, there's the idea of the intervention, where very occasionally the right word spoken at the right time can release something. But it's like with art, I think of that as a type of intervention sometimes. Like a person working with something with their hands and having some sort of physical object to reflect on can open something up, can just and can fundamentally kind of bring a light or dissipate a weight. And I saw that very much with what you were doing at Spark Retreat, where people are able to begin to put words to their own individual woundedness. I was actually reading just today the difference between this guy Sergio Benventino, I think is his surname, the Spanish philosopher, psychoanalyst, but the difference between, he talked about fright, fear and anxiety. And it was very interesting to me because there's an idea that what we try to do as human beings is turn our traumas into triumphs. And sometimes we do that by, it comes out in our sexuality as well, that something that was very painful is eroticized, or we keep repeating in our nightmares. Our traumas return in various ways, whether negative ways or in sexual ways. But he had a very interesting way of describing it. So fright is like, there's a car accident. You don't expect it, it just happens. And you don't have any words to describe it. This horror happens. And then what the human being does is they turn the fright into fear. And what he said is that's where you have a representation. Then you have a memories. So you suddenly turn it into, that was a car crash, and you have words to describe it. And then you can, maybe you're afraid of driving, or driving on a certain road, or afraid of driving at a certain speed. So that's the fright, which has got nothing to hang on to. It's just terror. It turns into fear, which you can manage, because then you can avoid driving in cars or whatever. And then anxiety is where the representation disappears and you're left with the feeling, but it's got no connection to anything. And so you might be going through life and for no apparent reason you start to feel anxious, or somebody says something to you that's so inane but it really hits you and it knocks you off course. Because in a way the original fright, which turned into fear has been lost. There's no words, and so you have this weird affect, this depression that arises, these panics, this anger, whatever it is that, and you go like, it seems divorced from anything. There's no reason for it. And part of the work, as you say, of the artist potentially is sometimes is to help create a space where people can begin to knit together the anxiety with the representation, and ultimately beneath that there is something unspeakable.
Yes.
But by putting it into the symbolic in some way and talking about your relationship with your siblings, your mother, your father, your work colleagues, you can begin to dissipate that suffering. You know, so that's an interesting work. And you've talked about how, like, I mean, initially, were you collecting stories just anonymously? Is that on the street?
Yeah, on the street. Yeah, they're all anonymous. It started off as an exhibition. I put these pots in an exhibition, and I got people emailing me, just members of the public, telling me they'd seen the work, and you know, they just gave me their scar story, and it just kept happening, and that's when I thought, if I just place these little pots in the wild. And I love that art it's not a luxury, it should be a birthright. I love the idea that anyone could find this pot. They didn't have to walk into an institution or an art gallery. They could find a little piece of art and they could find the magic of art, that it spoke into their deepest story. And that's why partly I put them on the street. I just love the idea that anyone could find them, and that everyone deserved it. And yeah, just the floodgates of stories, and they're all anonymous. And I do use some of those stories in my workshop. I use an audio, and those stories are read. And then in the end of the workshop, I invite people to use or work with some clay, and they make their own scar pot. And what's really interesting, I got some feedback from the workshops, and I play the stories again then after they make their own pot. And a lot of people will say that it's a very different experience listening to the audio after you have physically made your own pot and you've marked your own wound. And I invite people to scar their pot in whatever way they want. And I don't give much direction, I just give them a ball of clay, and it's a very simple pinch pot method. And some people will choose 3 scars because maybe there was 3 things that they were thinking about. Some people will choose to scar on the inside, some on the outside. One woman covered hers in scars.
Wow.
And even that is, some people then break the clay into 2 or 3 bowls, and they make 3 separate pots with 3 separate scars. So it's very interesting how people approach the clay and what comes out. And I don't think even a lot of it is conscious. Some of it is, but to hold their pots and listen to those stories again. It invites them to listen in a new way, and hopefully connects to some of what they are trying to process.
So where did this idea come from for you? Like, was it by happenstance? Was it something very concrete? Was it
the original pot story? Yeah, it was really only ever meant to be a private gift to a friend. So I had a friend who was going through breast cancer surgery, and I just made it for her. It was just my way of, acknowledging her wounds and what she was going through. And it was never meant to be an exhibition or a public art trail or a workshop, but I always just said it was my visual poem to her. And anyone who knows who've walked with somebody close to them who's going through something like that, as I said, that's when there almost are no words. And so this was the closest thing that I had to a poem, a visual poem, an ode to her. And then it was a friend of mine who's a curator, and she knew about the little project, and she said, I'd love this to be part of an art trail she was planning in Manchester. And then that's how it started. It started as an exhibition, and then it led into a public art project. Yeah. And now workshops, thanks to Spark. Yeah.
Yes, very good. And you've told me some stories before, but you told me stories of people who have written to you in the aftermath of finding one of these pots. Was there one? Well, you tell me. There's a couple of stories I remember you telling me.
Oh yeah, there's so many powerful stories, and it all sorts from grief, cancer, all sorts of wounding. I think the stories that really stand out for me are when I meet the people on the street. That feels really special. So I remember in Belfast meeting this woman on the last day, and I had just put a pot outside the Duke of York, and this woman came over, and I saw her pick up the pot, and she cradled it for a long time, and I went over and I said, hi, I'm Rachel, I'm the artist, like, did you know about the project, or did you stumble across it? Because of course some people just stumble across them and others come in to find them. And she said, Rachel, I've been searching for your pot for 2 days. And she called it a pilgrimage of hope, where she said she lost her husband after 35 years of marriage. And she said, searching for your pot is what my grief feels like, which I'm just searching for something to hold, something beautiful to hold. And she shared poems that her husband had written before he passed away. And it was a beautiful conversation, and I felt completely privileged to have it. What an honour to share that with her on the street. And then afterwards she went home and she uploaded a story to the website, and it was about 2 pages long, really beautifully written. And she said that after finding the pot, she went home and she started to garden for the first time since losing her husband. And she said she had tended to new shoots, which something about that line I thought was so poetically beautiful and profound. But yeah, I get lots of stories from people. Yeah, as I said, there's a lot of cancer stories, there's a lot of loss. When I did the project in Manchester, I kept bumping into women my age who were coming in to find the pots, but not for themselves, which I thought was beautiful, but for their terminally ill mums. I kept finding that in Manchester. And one woman, she came in, she found this pot for her mum who'd stage 4 lung cancer. And then when she sent me this photograph on Instagram of her mum in the hospital bed holding my scar pot. Oh. And yeah, I get a lot of mental health stories as well. Yeah, it really varies, but people are so, I think that's what surprises me, people are so willing to speak. And I guess that's partly, again, what art does, it creates rituals for you to speak your story. I think people are craving for it. You almost have to ask the question, it comes spilling out.
Yeah, there's like, I mean, all of us, it's very common, we want to make life better for ourselves and the people who are around us, and there is always a tendency, and Simone Weil calls it their will and attentiveness, that will is part of the very core of life, that we will change, we want to change, we want to move forward, we want to maximize what we're doing, we want to achieve things, nothing wrong with any of that. But you go into a bookshop and you go to the self-help section or whatever, a lot of it will be about how to kind of make changes. But sometimes, I mean, there's nothing you can do. And terminal illness is a good example, and also potentially there's a deep truth to that, and this is what Weil calls attentiveness, that yes, we want to change things we can change and make our lives better, but there's a space we need to create in our lives where we're simply attentive to the nature of life and the fragile nature of life and the finitude of life and the wounds of life, without being able to do anything about it. And just that attentiveness to our stories and attentiveness to those wounds is itself something deeply powerful. But it's very different from, like, okay, we're going to fight this. Of course you want to fight an illness, we're going to fight this, we're going to do what we can, but at the same time as fighting an illness, there is the illness that's called life. That is, that even if you win, there's something that you won't win. And I don't know, there's something about your work that is about attentiveness to me, attentiveness to that moment. And it's, again, you wouldn't want to live there all the time, but we need those spaces where we're just attentive to the wounds that we carry, the wounds that we'll always carry, that that we'll never get over. I've a friend who his son took his own life just maybe 2 years ago now. It was 2 years ago, just recently, and I was talking to him, and he's a very well adjusted he's a therapist, he's just going, but like, you're going, like, there's no getting over this. there's no talk that will fix this. There's no dissipating this void, this black hole that is in my life. There's ways to live with it in some way, because he has to live. He has to. He's got another child. He's got a family. He has to live. They have to live. But 2 years, and it just feels like it was yesterday. Yeah. And potentially that will always be the case. And all he can do, to say, oh, you know what, it's going to be better. It'll be better next week. Like, that's just so wrong in every possible way. All we could do is sit and be attentive to that impossible wound.
Yeah. No, I absolutely. Yeah, I agree. It's and I think that is hopefully what my work does, is that it just said this happened. It's almost like saying, yes, this happened. I see it. Yeah. And when I did the workshop in a church context recently, and there was this older woman who listened, and at the end, the vicar had said, oh, does anyone want to say anything to Rachel after the workshop? And everyone gave quite kind feedback, and this older woman was quite teary, and she said, that was really beautiful what you said. And I said, thank you. And then she said, and your accent is just so beautiful. And she started, and she was very teary about this, and I thought, there's a story there. Like, as beautiful as the Tyrone accent is, it's not it's not that emotional. But I could sense there is something else there that you're not saying. I could sense from just the way she was so moved. I thought, there's a story, and it's not mine to know. I'm available if people want to tell me them, but only if they want to, and it's helpful. And then after the talk, I was packing up, and she asked if I had brought a few pots with me, and she asked if she could buy one, and I said certainly. And she said, would you take a check? And I said, Valerie, I haven't taken a check since 1998.
Yes.
But
I wouldn't know how to take a check.
I wouldn't know what to do with a check. So yeah, and all I said to her was, there was 2 pots, and one had a shallow scar and one had a deep scar, because all the scars are different. And I said, do you want one with a deep scar or a shallow scar? And she said, a deep one. And I thought, yes, there's a story. Now, this is a woman who's in her 80s. You can't get to your 80s without a wound or a deep wound. And then a couple of days passed, and then I got an email from her, and it was, again, about 2 pages long. And she said that she said, thank you again for your workshop. And she said, your scar pot is now sitting on my mantelpiece between a framed photograph of my late husband, who died of alcoholism, and my son, who died of alcoholism. And that alone, like, just that image alone of where that pot is resting now, and what that pot represents in her life, in her story. And when I replied to that email, I don't even feel like I attend to it. I almost feel that is the work as well. That's, you can throw pots and turn pots and glaze them and put them on streets, but actually attending to that email is the heart of what my work is about.
Yes, that's that's the attentiveness. That's where it's between the fright of the event and the anxiety which comes when you try to push it away. Just get on with life, live your life, everything's fine, and you pursue things. You've got the anxiety. But to be able to put words to that event, and to be able to somehow, like on that mantelpiece, have a little altar, a little thing that's painful. It's tragic, that's the thing, it's painful. Aristotle, he used the term catharsis, which is kind of a painful release, like getting massaged in a knot. It's painful, but it's also, it does something. But like having an altar like that is painful. Like in one sense, if aliens came down, you go, why would you ever do that? Why would you ever remind yourself of that suffering? And of course, that's what we often do. We do want to remind ourselves. But there is something about being able to be attentive and to stand in the storm of that, that is healing. Yeah, in its woundedness.
Yeah.
I mean, interesting. You're talking about doing this in conservative, in Christian context. That Christianity has had a really powerful tradition of wounds. I'm supervising a friend actually who's doing a PhD on radical theology and a theologian called Zinzendorf. I don't know much about Zinzendorf, so I'm supervising the philosophy side of it. But Zinzendorf was a theologian who developed what he called a wounded theology, a theology of the wound. And of course, you have this idea of the wounds of Christ. So you do have that depth of idea within the Christian tradition, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think this workshop, it can land in so many different settings for, you know, and people they can see different things in it, and they can take this is the thing about art. I always feel like once I make it in my workshop and I make it for my reason, and once I put it into the world, it's almost like I lose all control, you know, and I'm fine with that because it becomes whatever almost people need it to be. And so I will deliver it in one workshop and they'll see something in it, and I'll deliver it in a different workshop and they might see something different, but as long as they take what they need in that moment from it.
You just remind me, I have a great story I think I can tell. I've never told this before. This is the first time I've heard this story. I have a very dear friend who is very, very wealthy, and he invited us all for his, I think it was his 50th birthday, it's a lot of years ago, and he invited me and a pile of people to Necker Island. If you've heard of Necker Island, it's Richard Branson's.
Oh right, okay,
island.
oh wow.
So and this is like, whoa, kind of crazy, whatever. And went there. This must be 10 years ago now, or 7 years ago, and we went, and it was really amazing, crazy, just like on this island. It's absolutely ridiculous. And Richard Branson was there, and we all had dinner. And I remember my partner at the time, she was talking to him, and they were talking about private school. She was privately educated, and had a very horrible time with boarding school. Didn't like it at all. Very traumatizing experience. And what was really interesting is as they were talking, he started to tear up and talk about his just horrible, you know, just that he didn't like that his school experience. And there was just this sense in going like, well, here's a guy who is, you know, got everything, you know, one of the richest men in the world, and there is still a live scar, which he was happy, you know, we're all chatting, whatever, but go like, it's the same thing you had with the corporate thing of going like, oh yeah, you're meeting someone who is kind of like got basically won in the sense of what you think winning looks like in the world, and still carries scars, just like the rest of us. So that's kind of interesting to remember.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
What do you do with that? Yeah, Pascal had a very interesting way of describing, as he said, the rich, they have a way of protecting themselves more from what he calls boredom and despair, basically. So if you're rich, you've got loads of ways to have divertisement. In the old days, you had a jester, you know, you can have jesters, and you went out and you hunted. But today, if you're rich, you can go on holidays, you can go to Necker Island, you can do all of this stuff, and so you can kind of divert your attention. And say, so Pascal is a thing of going like, yeah, so the rich kind of like are able to avoid this wound more so than if you can't do all of those things. But he still goes, but the wound is there, and he almost goes, it's even worse sometimes when you have so many things to protect yourself from it, that you're actually getting further and further away from the thing that joins you to everybody. You're getting further and further away from, like, you can never get away from it because it's there, but in some way you're burying the thing that joins me with you and me with everyone else. So that's a way of kind of acknowledging, like if you've got money, you can kind of avoid it a lot more, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And in fact, that avoidance is its own weird form of suffering.
And lack of connection.
Which I've seen when I lived in America. I lived on the east coast of America, and someone lent me a house for a few years in an area which had people who had lots of money, and there was a real sense of disconnection. Physically, because the more money you have, the further you can live from somebody. I just came from the poorest area in Ireland to that, and you're living literally just, you know, there's a street of 100 people living on the street, to this place where you're physically separate, but also psychologically you feel kind of separate. And so I mean, you know, in my work, I'm really interested in how do we create social bonds around acknowledging this shared longing that marks us all. I mean, for me, that's the central kind of work. You know? And you've been doing that, like with these groups where you kind of create like a temporary social bond where a group of people can come together and actually put into words the things that mark them. Yeah. Do you ever remember Post Secret?
Yes, I do. Yes,
Yeah,
I did. I have that book probably somewhere. Yeah,
I have that book somewhere.
Yeah.
Probably long gone
Yeah.
now. All my books are in storage in various places. But yeah, Post Secret was interesting. It's kind of, there's a similar style where people would literally, wasn't it, put their secrets on postcards.
That's right, and post them to this artist. Isn't that right?
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And again, quite similar, isn't it? That need. If you ask someone, it almost spills out of them. It's almost, thank you for asking. You know,
Yes.
they've been holding it almost, and they're so willing to speak it. And as I say, that's why the arts are great, because they create the rituals and the language for that, and the spaces, the safe spaces to speak your truth, to tell your story.
And the real difficulty is when we're so divorced that we don't know how to put it into words. I don't know if you've encountered that or how that works. There's things that you can talk about, and then there's that sense in which you're so detached from from that wound that it speaks in the symptom, but it doesn't speak in your words. I wonder to what extent what you do has also helped people connect with something that they never were able to articulate before. That's probably hard to know, to be honest. But
It's probably hard to know. And I think if they can't do it, because part of the workshop you write it, you have a time to write. I think if you think, oh gosh, I don't know how to articulate that or put that in words, I think the clay will help. I think it will come out in the clay. I think how you choose to wound that part, whether that's even like you're not conscious, you just chose a wound that goes all the way around it, or a tiny wound, or a wound in the inside. Even if you don't know why you did that, even just paying attention to what you've just created, that you're now holding in your hand, of why that wound, why that deep, why in the inside, why can no one else see it? Even that is so interesting.
That's great. That's exactly right. Because of course, one of my weaknesses is I'm always trying to put things into words. But the power of this is precisely that, and that's what I'm trying to get at. So when you've got that anxiety, and you've got this something, there is something that is you're carrying, but you can't put it into words. The act of just working with something physically with your hands and marking it, that in and of itself can be the first totem, or what do you call it, like a memorial to that.
Yes.
That then actually over time might be able to be put into words, but still it is a form of language. It's a form of expressing something.
It's the first step. And that can then just unlock something or release something that maybe the words then will flow afterwards.
Because this is what, the reason why, again, I love this conversation is I'm trying to find the people who are doing the similar work in different areas, the musicians and the artists and the thinkers, and to kind of provide an expression of this notion that, because, well, in traditional religion you have pre-fall, fall, and post-fall, right? It's that kind of, in sacred and secular forms, there was my life was fine, something happened that was a disaster, and I can get over it. And there's, something very interesting about that story, but in this kind of more profound sense, the idea is that, to be a subject is to be wounded, to be the subject is from the very beginning wounded. I mean, this is why I actually love the term original sin, in the sense of original lack, original cut. So not in the religious sense of you're bad or whatever, but just that there's an originary cut that marks us, that we don't kind of get beyond, but we can make beautiful and we can carry. And that message, in a world where there's the idea of a pre-traumatic subject and a post-traumatic subject, which, to be honest, I think causes all sorts of problems, because you start to fantasize that everybody else is post-traumatic, everyone else is having a great time, and you're not. Like, I remember my favorite coffee shop in LA was called Deus Ex Machina, and there was this woman who worked there, and she was super cool, and she was really attractive, and she was just really interesting, and you always see her with interesting people. And I just remembered always thinking, God, like, she has such an interesting life, you know. And then a few months later, I stopped seeing her. I asked somebody, and she took her own life. And it was really shocking to me, because I had placed so much of a fantasy of her life, because it looked so amazing, you know, and she looked amazing, and her friends looked amazing, and she was manager of this really cool coffee shop or whatever. And it was like, oh yeah, that's what we do. I was fantasizing a non-traumatic subject, a subject who is freed from the painful dimensions of life. And for me, it's always useful to remember that we all carry something of longing and suffering, that vague notion of suffering, and there is what they call no non-castrated other in psychoanalysis, no one without the cut. We're all cut, and that acknowledgement sounds like bad news, but actually it was profoundly liberating to me. I was like many people, under the weight in the past of thinking there was some perfection that I could have in life and whatever, and actually realizing that there's something about life that is inherently dissatisfying, and that's what makes it satisfying. That's what makes it that's what gives it its power, that's what gives it its interest. That insight, I think, is deeply, deeply powerful. And anything that I think helps to express that, I'm very much behind.
Yes, you know. Yes, well, thank you.
So where can people see your material and find out more about this work?
Yeah, I mean, on my socials, like Instagram, probably mainly, and my website, Rachel Ho, and my Instagram is Rachel Ho Ceramics, and I usually post whatever I'm working on there. There's an exhibition on in Manchester at the moment with this work, where I have the pots, photographs, and the stories all together in little clusters. I would love to keep working on it as an exhibition, actually, and including the audio, so it's quite an immersive exhibition where you've got sound and the photos and the pots, and because I've been overwhelmed to say it's like floodgates of stories. There is something about it, and I feel like a custodian to the stories I've collected, and how do you honour those? And so I would love it to be an exhibition eventually, with the stories on audio, so you walk in and you are immersed in this, and hopefully then, as you say, we feel seen and connected in that, because that's also what we have inside us.
Yes. Yeah, that's the universal for me. Is like we try to find things that join us, like positive universals, like, oh, we share, you know, I'll say a language in common or whatever, but there's always someone excluded, of course, because every time you create a boundary of we all like football, well, there's people who don't like football or whatever, so I like fashion, or I like whatever it is, and that's fine, because we hang out in groups that think the same as us, and that's part of life. And but at a fundamental level, what joins us is not something but a nothing. What joins us is this lack that we all carry, and what does it mean to have a social bond that's structured around that? And I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about what you're doing before we finish up? Is there, or any projects that you're working on? Are you doing anything else? I bought another piece of yours, which was the envelope.
The envelope.
Yes.
Yeah, I do have Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work is around this idea of I do have this thread running through my work of, I guess, beauty and brokenness and the juxtaposition of those two things. And yeah, so I make paper clay envelopes with an Emily Dickinson poem, scarred pots. I'm working now on a new pots where I collect shards from rivers, and I press these pottery shards into clay, and they form what's known in ceramics as stress cracks. That's the kind of technical term in ceramics, but it made me think of, you know, the stories that we inherit, because of course these little shards in rivers it was once somebody's cup or plate or bowl, they ate off it, conversations were had, and yet now they just wash up on the ebbs of our landscapes. But I love that it connects me to another human who no longer exists, but the idea of the stories that we inherit, and they can be both beautiful and broken, and they too can form stress cracks, and what you do with that tension between old and new stories. So that's sort of what I'm working on at the minute. I'm exploring that.
Do you think there's anything about being from Northern Ireland that makes us interested in this stuff? I just suddenly was really, as I was listening to it, I was like, because somebody said that to me recently, like, you know, in the 90s when you started doing this stuff, you know, there's something about Northern Ireland that was in what you were doing. So what do you think? Definitely,
and I think definitely bringing the project back to Belfast. I felt quite emotional actually, because I had led the project in Stoke and Manchester, and bringing it back to Belfast, it made me more emotional than I even expected. And there was something about bringing it to a place that has, I mean, you don't have to look far to see wounds and scars in this place, and the fragility of repair that you can see. And so I sensed that very much, and some people did reflect that back in stories in Belfast. Some people did talk about this place and the wound of this place and the wound of the Troubles, and then obviously growing up with, you know, conservative evangelicalism, you know, it's a lot of us have inherited that story, and even though it's not necessarily a story that people continue, it's still something you can still see beauty in it. And it's just a very, I think honestly that's why I'm maybe quite obsessed with this theme of the juxtaposition of the beautiful and the broken.
Yes. No, there's something, as a few people have said it to me recently, and I'm like, yes, we grew up during the Troubles, also seeing the peace process and being in a city that is fractured and a divided city, but also a city that was able to kind of like move forward. And so there's something about the city that I think maybe inspired the different respective works that we're part of. And I do want to reflect more on that at some point, because you know, this little crazy part of the world, something about brokenness and the beauty of that, and the finding some beauty in tragedy. That's the stuff that we drink up here.
Yes, it is. Yeah, we're experts in it. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
No, thank you.